Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're stepping back, way back into, well, one of the deepest and coldest truths of human prehistory.
We really are.
We're taking on a really critical and challenging investigation into how our ancestors survived the Ice Age. And this is where we have to confront one of the most difficult, but also, I think, most profoundly revealing parts of the human journey. It's about the ultimate tragic choice that Ice Age parents had to face.
It really is a discussion that requires a kind of historical empathy. You have to set aside all the safety nets we have now, the morality that comes from, well, from abundance.
Right. No cities, no laws.
Exactly. Our sources are documenting a period, stretching from about 2 million to 10,000 years ago, where there was just ice and hunger and constant, unrelenting danger. So the mission here, it's not to judge, it's to understand the brutal logic that just governed existence.
And that logic, it leads us straight to this devastating decision that again and again fell on the mothers of the Ice Age. The necessity of choosing which newborn could live and which one needed to die. I mean, it's a shocking idea when you hear it through a 21st century filter. But the sources, they provide what feels like overwhelming evidence that this was a necessary, almost routine act of triage.
And we're going to use the anthropological and archaeological data you provided to really unpack that reality. We have to understand why selective infanticide existed, why it was so common, and maybe most critically, why. Within the harsh, inescapable world of the Ice Age, it was often the most rational decision possible.
A desperate act of love.
In a way, yes. A desperate act performed to protect the entire family group. We're really tracing the human story back to its absolute limits here.
Okay, so let's start with setting the stage, because the environment in this story, it feels like it's the main character, really.
It's the protagonist and the antagonist all at once. It dictates everything.
We're talking about the Pleistocene epoch. So millions of years, characterized by these repeated glacial cycles. This isn't just a slightly colder winter.
Oh no, not at all. This was an ecosystem that was fundamentally hostile to human life, generation after generation. The environment imposed an absolute set of physical laws. You have to grasp the sheer scale of the cold.
What are we talking about, temperature-wise?
Imagine temperatures that routinely plunged not just below freezing, but way below. Think minus 20 degrees Celsius. And in some inland areas, it would hover closer to minus 40.
Minus 40.
Yeah. That cold was a constant, grinding, metabolic enemy. It's always trying to kill you.
When we talk about the physics of survival, it's all about heat, right?
Yeah.
In those conditions, your body is just constantly dumping heat into the air.
Constantly. Just to maintain your core temperature, never mind doing anything else, your ancestors had to generate a huge amount of metabolic energy. And that means they needed a vast, constant supply of calories just to not freeze to death.
Before you even think about hunting or walking.
Before you even take a step. And the physical effort required was immense. The search for fuel, for calories, it was relentless. If you were in a hunter-gatherer group on the move, you weren't just going for a nice walk.
No.
Anthropologists estimate they could cover 10, maybe 15 miles a day. And this is across treacherous, frozen, uneven ground. And the worst part, there was never a guarantee you'd find anything.
You could walk all that way and find absolutely nothing.
And burn thousands of precious calories in the process.
And even when they did find something, the expectation wasn't, a big bison kill every week. The norm was famine.
That's what the archaeological record shows. Prolonged periods where groups were subsisting on these incredibly poor diets. Not high-fat nuts and seeds, but frozen roots, stored starches, things like frozen cattail rhizomes.
So,
bulk, really.
Exactly. Bulk to fill the stomach, but very little fat, very little high-quality protein. And those are the things you need to maintain body heat, to insulate against the cold, and crucially, to support a pregnancy or lactation. Which brings us to the core of this whole thing, the economy of calories.
The economy of calories, everything was a zero-sum game.
The entire caloric budget of a small family group, say, 8 to 12 people? It's always on the brink of collapse. Every single action has a price tag.
And we can even put some rough numbers on it based on modern hunter-gatherer studies. A single hunter on a good day might burn 3,000 or 4,000 calories. What about the mother? Tanning a large hide, scraping it for days, that's thousands of calories. Building a shelter against a blizzard, a massive group effort.
So if the calories coming in didn't meet that incredibly high output,
the group was literally on a ticking clock to starvation. There was no safety margin, none whatsoever.
And that's where the cost of a mistake becomes just terrifyingly absolute.
The sources are really clear on this. Minor failures could cascade into mass death. A badly made windbreak fails in the night, the whole family gets hypothermia, and that's it. A hunter breaks his leg. He goes from the main calorie provider to a calorie drain.
Potentially dooming everyone.
Yes, and this connects directly to our focus today. Something as seemingly small as a baby crying too loudly.
That attract predators.
Cave lions, wolves, giant bears. That sound was a dinner bell. It was a beacon pointing right to your shelter. In that world, noise itself was lethal. Survival demanded silent efficiency.
Which is, it's a critical perspective shift for us. Because today, a newborn is seen as this source of joy, of unlimited hope.
It's a product of our overwhelming abundance.
But in the Ice Age, a newborn was an enormous, immediate, and potentially lethal risk to the entire group.
It was an overnight shock to that fragile caloric balance. It always pushed the group towards a deficit. And we really need to detail the physical demands that a baby, especially a weak one, imposed on a migrating family.
Yeah.
It's so much more than just finding more food.
Okay, so let's break it down. First, there's just heat. A newborn needs constant warmth.
Constant thermoregulation. So the mother or someone has to provide body heat all the time. That means they can't rest, they can't move as much, it increases their own calorie burn rate, and it means you need more fuel for the fire, which takes more time and energy to gather. It's a vicious cycle.
And they needed to be carried constantly. A 10 or 15 pound baby doesn't sound like much, but for 15 miles over frozen ground while you're already wearing heavy furs.
It drastically increases the mother's energy expenditure, and it reduces her ability to do other essential things like gather that fuel or process food.
And that extra burden, it slows the entire group down.
Which could be a death sentence. If you're following a migratory herd or trying to escape a sudden cold snap, you need speed. Any delay because of a struggling mother and infant could mean you miss the herd entirely. You get caught out in the open, time was a resource, and a new baby consumed that resource.
And all of this leads to the direct impact on the mother.
Who was the absolute linchpin of the group? The biological infrastructure for the future. A new baby posed this specialized, amplified physiological threat directly to her. And the logic was simple. If the mother failed, everyone died.
Why was she so singularly critical? I mean, the father was the hunter, but the mother.
The mother was continuity. She processed the meat, she mended the clothes and shelter, she held the social group together, and she nurtured the children who were already viable. If she collapsed, those older, stronger kids had no chance.
The strain on her must have been relentless.
Let's focus on that maternal strain. In extreme cold and with so few calories, a woman's body burns through its necessary fat reserves incredibly quickly. And those reserves are vital not just for warmth, but for reproductive function, for sustaining lactation.
And the calorie cost of breastfeeding alone.
Yeah.
You mentioned a number earlier.
An astonishing 400 to 700 extra calories a day, on top of the 2,500 to 3,000 she needed just to survive the cold and the migration.
So you're basically asking a starving person to produce an extra meal's worth of energy out of thin air every single day.
Precisely. And many were already severely malnourished when they gave birth. Now, this is crucial for understanding why infanticide was so routine. Normally, nature has a way of self-regulating.
Right.
When a woman is that malnourished, her body often shuts down fertility. It's a state called amenorrhea. It's a way to prevent back-to-back pregnancies that the body just can't support.
So it's a natural birth spacing, survival mechanism.
Exactly. It spaces births out by 3, 4, even 5 years. That ensures the older child is weaned and strong before a new one comes along. But under the immense constant stress of the Ice Age, that natural suppression often failed. And you'd get pregnancies spaced too closely together.
And that's where the impossible choice comes in.
That is the devastating logic. When a new baby arrives before the older sibling is self-sufficient, the mother faces this critical resource calculation. She cannot successfully breastfeed 2 dependents at once.
So saving the newborn, who might be weak anyway,
meant directly risking the life of the viable toddler, and almost certainly risking her own. So mothers had to assess a baby's chances immediately, coldly. If the viability was low, the choice was forced on them. Saving the mother and the older child required the swift sacrifice of the newcomer.
Because the mother's survival was the only moral imperative that could guarantee the lineage continued.
It was the only one that mattered.
So if this was triage, it must have been systematic, not random?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't panic. This was a devastating but internally rational system. And mothers had this practical, hard-won knowledge. They could identify low viability almost instantly.
And this knowledge was just passed down.
The accumulated wisdom of generations who had lived and died by these very calculations. They didn't have modern medicine, but they had data points to calculate risk. And anthropologists have been able to identify a sort of checklist of criteria that determine the baby's fate.
Okay, let's go through those because this is where the chilling pragmatism really comes into focus.
Yeah.
What were the clearest signs of non-viability?
The first category is just the infant's physical state. A premature birth was an obvious disqualifier. The caloric and warmth demands were just too high to meet.
Yeah.
Any visible, severe deformities or birth injuries. Again, that indicated a long-term dependency the group couldn't possibly sustain while on the move, and critically, extreme weakness, an inability to nurse effectively.
How would they measure that?
Simply whether the baby could successfully draw milk or was too lethargic to even try. Investing precious calories into an infant who can't even ingest them is a losing game from the start.
And then there are the environmental factors, the timing of the birth itself.
A huge non-negotiable factor, yes. A baby born in that brief summer window had a few months to pack on some protective fat to gain strength before winter hit.
But a midwinter birth.
A midwinter birth, when resources were at their absolute lowest and travel was hardest. That often meant the group simply did not have the extra fat, fuel, or time to sustain that infant until spring. That timing alone could seal its fate.
It always comes back to the mother's own state.
Always. A lack of maternal milk supply, often from her own malnutrition, was a definitive sign. It meant the baby was doomed to a slow starvation, and it would drain the mother in the process.
And there's one more detail that connects back to the predators we mentioned, the crying.
Yes. Continuous crying. This wasn't just an annoyance. If a baby was in constant distress, it signaled something was wrong. Pain from the cold, colic from poor quality milk, or just inherent weakness. And that sound was a continuous high-risk flag for every predator in the area.
The group's survival depended on silence.
And a constantly crying infant broke that fundamental rule.
And finally, circling back to what you said earlier, the sibling factor.
The critical sibling factor. The existence of another very small child still breastfeeding or needing high levels of care. It meant the mother was metabolically incapable of nourishing both. So the established survivor, who had already cleared those first brutal hurdles, was prioritized over the uncertain newcomer.
It's a logic that prioritizes proven viability over potential.
Driven entirely by scarcity, it wasn't about ideology, it was pure, hardline survival mathematics.
We don't have written records, obviously. So how did archaeologists figure out the methods used? And how do we even talk about this with the sensitivity it deserves?
We rely on a couple of things. Negative evidence, so what the bones don't show us, and comparative anthropology, studying similar groups today. What we see is that the methods seem to prioritize speed, minimal energy use, and often silence.
And they suggest passive action rather than active violence.
Which reinforces that concept of triage over malice. The methods deduced would leave little to no skeletal trauma. That's the key indicator.
So what does that include?
Things like simple abandonment in the extreme cold. It would be a swift death from exposure, often right after birth, which saved the mother from any prolonged caloric drain. Other deductions point to suffocation, which leaves no trace on the skeleton, or drowning.
And the most passive method of all.
Failure to stimulate breathing after birth. If the mother had already made that devastating calculation, she could simply allow the natural process to stop.
And this would have been a solitary act.
In many of the groups observed, yes. The mother performed the act alone, or maybe with the support of elder women, but in private, believing they were preventing a much greater drawn-out suffering for the child and certain death for the rest of the group. The burden was immense and deeply personal.
So we've laid out the cold, hard logic. But now we have to face the paradox that makes this so profoundly human, the emotional context. If we judge this from our world of safety and abundance, it just seems monstrous.
And we have to reframe it. In the Ice Age, this was not punishment. It wasn't hatred or malice.
It was necessary.
It was. We define it as a kind of desperate love, distorted by circumstances. Their ability to love and form attachments wasn't gone. It was just channeled by absolute necessity. The definition of love in that world was survival. Love dictated that the mother save her strength for the children she could save.
Let's just state the survival utility one more time, because it's so important.
It's an exercise in group economics. If the whole family is on the verge of starvation because the mother is wasting her last drops of energy on a non-viable infant, sacrificing that infant instantly changes the math.
It preserves her energy.
It ensures the viable children get what little milk there is, and it saves the entire family unit.
So the emotional toll they felt wasn't because they were detached. It was the result of this agonizing calculation.
Exactly. These women were unbelievably strong, physically and mentally, but the sources are very clear they were not emotionally cold.
And how do we know that for sure, without diaries or written histories?
We know it because of the evidence of grief, of ritual. The fact that they made the choice and survived doesn't mean they didn't suffer. They suffered deeply. They mourned. And that mourning shows up not in words, but in action, in the caloric investment they made to memorialize the lost child.
Talk about that archaeological evidence, because the idea of spending calories on grief is, it's powerful.
It is. First, you have the careful, intentional burials. In a world defined by the economy of calories, digging a hole in frozen ground or permafrost is an immensely strenuous task.
You're spending thousands of calories, a full day's ration maybe,
just to chip away at frozen earth. To spend that much energy risking your own future hunger for a deceased infant who could have just been left to the elements. It proves the emotional need outweighed the physical cost.
The commitment is just staggering.
It shows that the group was prioritizing their psychological health, honoring the lost life over immediate energy savings. They needed to process that loss. We see evidence of symbolic rituals, things like red ochre, a pigment that often suggests life or blood, and the careful positioning of the body. These aren't just practical disposals, they're acts of farewell.
And the objects left in the graves. That's the most poignant detail for me.
Small shells, polished stones, little beads, these were often valuable.
Things they couldn't easily replace.
To bury a valuable, non-renewable resource with a non-viable infant is the clearest proof of attachment you could ask for. It's a statement. It says, we couldn't save you, but you were valued. We honor you, even though the world demanded your life.
So the conclusion is, they loved their children, but they lived in a world where love alone just wasn't enough to keep them alive.
And that stark reality is why we feel such revulsion today. We operate with these incredible safety nets, hospitals, formula, food on every corner. But to understand our ancestors, we have to look at the past through their eyes, where morality was dictated by the physics of survival.
We also have to stress that this wasn't some local anomaly. This wasn't one group in one corner of the world.
No, the archaeological data shows this was widespread. It seems to be a universal human adaptation to extreme resource stress.
And that universality it's powerful.
We find these same patterns across huge geographic areas. Ice Age sites in Siberia, across Europe, early groups in the Americas. Wherever early humans ran into sustained glacial cycles and this kind of mobile, calorie-starved lifestyle, the same brutal calculations were often necessary.
And the evidence isn't just that a lot of infants died. It's more specific than that. What are archaeologists looking for in these graves that points to this specific practice?
They're looking for clusters of graves of newborns, usually less than a month old. But the crucial piece of evidence, as we touched on, is the negative evidence, specifically the absence of severe trauma in the skeletons.
Why is the absence of trauma so important?
Because if these infants were dying from accidents, falls, animal attacks, random violence, the bones would likely show fractures, crushing injuries. The lack of that kind of trauma suggests nonviolent or passive methods of death.
The abandonment, the suffocation.
Exactly. It aligns with the theory of a rapid triage designed to minimize suffering and energy use, not random aggression. The passive nature reinforces the idea of a clinical, survival-driven logic.
And this is supported by the group demographics that did survive.
Yes, there's a strong correlation between these early infant deaths and the robust survival of slightly older siblings in the same group. The evidence suggests the family was successfully funneling its very limited resources, mostly the mother's milk and her own strength, towards the children who had already proven they could survive the Ice Age's initial assault.
Which brings us to that chilling statistic. For many of these prehistoric groups, what was the infant mortality rate?
It could reach as high as 40%.
40%.
It's a staggering number. And it indicates that selective infanticide wasn't some rare, desperate act. It was likely a predictable, integral, and routine part of their survival strategy.
If almost half your children don't make it through the first year, then the choice to not invest in the weakest ones becomes normalized, a strategic necessity.
And it forces us back to the physiology of it all. It shows the fundamental mismatch between the human gestation cycle and the Ice Age environment. We talked about that natural birth spacing of 3 to 4 years.
That biological safety valve.
When that safety valve failed, A mother could find herself with a new baby when the previous one was barely 2 years old. Imagine the caloric demand. 2 children totally dependent on her body, plus her own survival in minus 30 degrees, marching 15 miles a day.
It's a metabolic debt no human can sustain.
Which is why the selection criteria were so ruthlessly immediate. The mother knew within hours of birth whether she could produce enough milk, whether she could sustain the energy drain. The choice wasn't about whether to save the baby, but whether to allow the baby to slowly starve while taking her and the older sibling down with it.
So in our world, we invest in potential. In their world, they could only invest in immediate, proven viability.
Every single calorie spent on a low-viability infant was a calorie stolen directly from the mother, accelerating her collapse and guaranteeing the death of the viable child. The logic is brutal, but it's undeniable in that context.
This constant cycle of birth and potential loss, it must have just normalized tragedy.
It did. The group would have understood, probably without ever saying it, that when a mother went into labor, there were 2 equally likely outcomes: a new member of the group or a swift, necessary sacrifice. That shared understanding might have reduced some of the individual guilt, even if the mother bore the primary emotional weight.
And we keep coming back to the grief, the caloric proof of love, the fact that they would spend massive energy on burials.
It's the ultimate evidence against the idea that they were emotionally primitive. To choose a small, controlled period of hunger now to satisfy the deep human need to grieve. That's not primitive, that's profoundly human.
The grief wasn't a luxury. It was a requirement for the survivors to maintain their mental cohesion, to keep going.
Precisely, they had to honor the loss to move forward. The ritual formalized the closure. It allowed the mother to redirect her emotional and physical energy back to the living.
So we have to wrap our heads around this cognitive dissonance. The Ice Age mother had to be a survival strategist first, making a life or death calculation. But immediately after, she had to become a mourning mother, investing precious resources into a ritual of remembrance.
And her ability to toggle between that absolute objective necessity and that profound subjective grief that defines the strength of our ancestors. They survived because they were tough enough to make the choices and human enough to mourn the cost.
It's so important to keep addressing why this is so hard for us to hear today. Our revulsion is a function of our privilege. It is not a sign of moral superiority.
We live in a world where we spend fortunes to save a premature infant because we can. We have the food, the medicine, the heated rooms. Our modern morality is a product of that safety net.
And if you took that safety net away,
the brutal logic of triage would reappear instantly. Their morality was functional. It was defined by what ensured the continuation of the lineage. To judge them by our standards is to misunderstand how we even got here.
we exist because of those acts. If they had operated under our moral rules, prioritizing every infant regardless of viability, their lineages, our lineages, would have been extinguished.
And you just gain this immense respect for their resilience to endure that physically and emotionally and still have the drive to keep going, to keep loving the children you can save. It's a level of strength that is almost impossible for us to fully grasp.
So we have come through this deep dive into the absolute, brutal logic of survival in the Ice Age. It's a story not of coldness, but of incomprehensible strength and tragic clarity.
The environment was the ultimate arbiter, and our ancestors had to answer its demands perfectly. Our very lineages are here because those women could operate as triage experts, survival strategists, and mourners, sometimes all on the same day.
This deep dive, it doesn't distance us from them. It illuminates their profound, imperfect humanity. They were fragile, they were flawed, but they had the resilience to survive a world that gave zero margin for error. They loved, but the ice was always colder.
We have to hold both truths at once: the crushing physical imperative and the deep emotional reality of their loss, their ability to make that sacrifice and then get up the next morning to care for the living. That is perhaps the greatest testament to the strength of the human spirit.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to reflect on, building on everything we've unpacked about resource allocation and those strict selection criteria. Given the routine nature of this potential sacrifice, and the fact that viability was often determined within the first few hours or days of life, how do you think that knowledge influenced the level of attachment, the bond, that a mother was psychologically even able to form with a newborn during that crucial initial period?
Did that survival mechanism necessitate a brief, crucial period of emotional detachment, a time that allowed the head to rule the heart until the infant's viability, its strength, its ability to nurse, its silence was absolutely confirmed? It's a question of profound psychological depth. It illustrates the true weight the Ice Age placed on the human mind, forcing the heart to wait for the body's confirmation.
Think about that impossible balance. Thank you for joining us for this essential deep dive into the brutal logic of human survival.
Until next time.